Hi, my name is Nathan. You're watching Nice at Dice, and today I am taking a look at this. It's a smallish RPG called Slayers by Spencer Campbell. It is basically a rules light fantasy RPG with an emphasis on asymmetrical heroes. So there's 4 different types of heroes you can play as. They're all Slayers, which means basically they are professional monster hunters. But they fall into 4 different classes. You have the Blade, the Gunslinger, the Arcanist, and the Tactician, and they all play very differently. So I'm going to walk you through basically what is involved with this game, what it has to offer, and then we'll come back here and I'll give you my thoughts on it. All right, so real quick, just to mention the physical properties of the product. It is a nice hardcover, beautiful cover, has some pretty nice artwork throughout. Pages are nice, glossy, full color. It's about 60 pages long, so it's not terribly short, but it's a pretty nice, quick, easy read. So yeah, physically, it's a nice product. And let's talk about what you find inside. So first of all, you're going to get an introduction, basically a rundown of the setting, the scenario. I'll get into that a little bit more, but as I've already mentioned, the heroes are by default Slayers, which are just professional monster hunters, and your job is to hunt monsters. Then right away, they introduce you to the rule of 4. The rule of 4 is the most basic principle of the game, which is that anytime you roll dice to determine success or failure, regardless of what you are rolling for or the size of the die that you are rolling, you are trying to get a 4 or higher. The game uses a variety of dice. You got your typical 6-sided, 4-sided, 8-sided, 10-sided polyhedral dice. And so obviously rolling a die with more sides is going to be better because better chance of getting a 4 or higher. So different things in the game are going to be rated by die sizes, and bigger dice are always better. So that's the basic principle of the game. It also mentions skills and gives you right here a rundown of 10 different skills that your characters possess some ability in. And these basically form the foundation of everything you're going to do in the game, except for combat. So outside of trying to kill other things, anything you want to attempt to do is going to revolve around using one of these skills. Combat is the theater of the mind style. So you're not going to have a map and minis and tactical movement and all that. It's basically just you paint the picture of what the scenario is, and players make their decisions based on the narrative. Distance is measured in relative distance, so characters may be engaged with one another, meaning they're close enough to attack each other with swords, etc. Or they might be near, which is not quite engaged, but not so far away. Or they could be far, so you'd have to shoot at them with a gun or a bow or something like that. And for a single move action, you can kind of transition between those relative distances. So if I am near to a monster and I want to attack it with my sword, for one move, I could become engaged, and then I'd be close enough to attack. Those are just the basics of that. Each character on their turn is going to have 2 actions in combat, and those actions are basically move, attack, use a skill, or use a quick action, quick actions being specific to each class. They have a nice rule here about advantage and disadvantage, which is that sometimes there's going to be circumstances that would favor or put you at a disadvantage, and the rule for that is just either if the situation favors you, you roll twice and use the better result, or if it doesn't favor you, you roll twice and use the lower result. Very simple. Damage, healing, and death is pretty straightforward. One little nuance of this that comes up with all the different classes, all kinds of situations, is that when you're rolling to attack, for example, let's say you're rolling an 8-sided die. If you roll a 4 or better, that's a hit, and then how much damage you do is based on how many hits you have. So a character might do 2 damage per hit, and in a particular situation, they might be rolling 3 dice. That's potentially 6 damage if all of those dice result in a hit. Then we get to character creation, which again is pretty straightforward and really focuses on the classes. So let's talk about that a little bit. Each class is similar in that they have hit points, they have speed, which basically determines how early in a combat round you get to act. And then they have some weapon dice and damage, right? They don't all have the weapon dice, that varies, but most of them do. And so basically what this is telling you is HP is how much damage you can take before you're knocked out. Speed, again, like I said, how soon in the round you get to act. Weapon dice, like in the case of the blade, is a d6, so that means he's going to be rolling a d6 every time he attacks, and for each hit that he rolls, he's going to do 2 damage, right? So you have some basic stats like that. Then each character has an attack action, which is different. So in the case of the blade, he just rolls his d6. If he rolls a hit, he gets to roll again. And if he hits again, he gets to roll again. He basically gets to keep rolling attacks until one of his attacks misses. So it's called the combo, lets him rack up a bunch of damage in a single round if he gets lucky with those rolls. Then you have a quick action. Every class has a quick action. In the case of the blade, the quick action lets him change stance. So he has flow, parry, and slay, and those modify his stats or abilities a little bit while he's in that stance until the stance changes because he wants to go into a different stance. Then you have what they call advances. Advances are basically special abilities that modify the way certain things work. So like, for example, one of his advances is footing, which lets him reroll the first one rolled during an attack. So he is rolling his attacks. One of his die comes up a 1, he can re-roll that once per attack, right? And the advances are other things along those lines, just little things that modify what the character can do or how the character works. Second class is the Gunslinger. The Gunslinger basically gets D6s, but he gets 4 of them to start with, and through advances he can get up to 6. So think of the Gunslinger as having basically your old Western 6-shooter, and each die represents a bullet. So you're going to actually put the dice on your character sheet to represent how many bullets you have in the chambers. And then when you attack, you can decide how many bullets you're going to shoot. And then you roll all those dice and can get multiple hits. But then you got to take a quick action to reload. So that's kind of his deal. Then you have the Arcanus. The Arcanus is not so big on putting out damage, but he has a variety of spells. In fact, he's got 2 pages of spells listed here. And these are, some of them do damage, but more they're more like utilitarian. They put different status effects on enemies and things like that. And then finally you have the Tactician. Now the Tactician's thing is pretty interesting. He has a very basic attack. It's relatively weak, but it's something he can do. But more important than that is at the beginning of each battle, he gets to roll a number of dice, okay? And the number of dice that he rolls is based on his tactics skill. So tactics is one of the 10 skills that you can learn. And so the higher that skill, the more of these dice he'll get to roll. And then basically he rolls that many 6-sided dice and kind of keeps them off to the side. And then over the course of the battle, anytime he wants, he can swap out a die that was just rolled, either by himself or an ally or one of the enemies, for one of the dice that he has in his little tactics pool, right? So if he has a 1 there, he can swap that out for a good roll that an enemy had. If he has a 6 there, he can swap that out for a poor roll that one of his allies had, etc. So he can influence, how the battle turns out in that way. All right. Then we go into the city. The city is the setting of the game. And I think this is a really interesting part of the game, is the setting. Basically, the idea is that the city, for some reason, some magical reason that's lost to time, is literally infinite. It's an infinite city. It stretches from horizon to horizon. And it's always growing. So you can never really leave the city. But the city is divided into different districts, and each district is almost like a small town in itself. It has its own character, own personality, etc. And that's one of the things that I think makes the game pretty interesting. You can, of course, come up with your own districts. I think that's a really fun way to, fun thing to do as the GM. But they also give you some examples of districts that could exist in the city. They start out with Slayer's Row, which is kind of a base of operations for the Slayers. And then we have some more. The Librarium is a pretty interesting one. Here's just a quick description at the end of this paragraph. It says, of the Librarium, factions fight for knowledge and dangerous things lurk between the increasingly crowded shelves. All right, that just catches my interest right away. It's basically like a library slash bookstore district. Okay. And each of these descriptions of the different districts will have, like one paragraph that gives you a description, and then it'll have, something like 6 to 8 key locations, factions, and NPCs. And then it'll give you 3 or 4 rumors that are just things your characters might hear that could lead to adventures. The wharf is another cool one. Hundreds of platforms tied together with rope bridges rise and fall with the dark waters below them. So there's, like I said, a variety of them. They're all pretty interesting. Those are just a couple of standouts. Then you have a GM section, just 2 pages of kind of some general tips for the GM, how to run the game. We talk about monsters, how monsters work, how to create monsters. And then we have the hunt. So this page right here just kind of gives the GM an idea of how to run a scenario in this game. And then we have some example scenarios. Each of them comes with 3 acts. It has stat blocks for monsters that you're going to need in the scenario. Basically everything you need to run the scenario. And there's, I think, about 3 of those. And then we get to the Beastie Area. And the Beastie Area has stat blocks for different enemies you might encounter, anything from bandits to gargoyles, goblins. We've got skeletons, trolls, vampires, etc. And there's about 30 of them. You can't see these very well, but just to kind of give you an idea what's involved here, you have a very brief description. They have hit points, and the hit points range in here from maybe as low as 5 to as high as like 17, 19, maybe 20. So that's kind of the range of hit points you're looking at in this game. So enemies don't take a lot to be defeated, but the heroes don't have a lot of hit points either. So combat tends to be pretty quick. People get taken out pretty quickly. All right. So like I was saying, you have HP, you have speed, which lets you know when they act during a round, and then you have actions. And so the actions, each monster has, maybe somewhere from like 2 to 5 different actions they can take. And the actions are pretty simple. It'll just be something like, it'll give you a die that you roll, and then it'll tell you what happens if you succeed. Maybe it does damage, maybe it puts some kind of status on a hero, things like that. And then you have the character sheets, which it's worth noting that it's a different character sheet for each character. You can see, for example, the Gunslinger has this spot here where you can track the bullets in his gun. You have the Arcanus and the Tactician, and then a quick rules reference on the back. So that's a quick rundown of the game. Let's go back up top and I'll tell you what it's like to play it. So first of all, kudos to Spencer Campbell, because this is essentially a indie production, but it has a really nice polished feel to it. And Spencer did all of the game design and writing, at least that's how he's credited in the book. Of course, he got some other artists involved, but apart from the artwork, the game design and the writing was all on his shoulders. And so I think that's pretty impressive. It's a well-designed, well-produced game for being an indie production like that. I do like the theme. He mentions in there that 2 of his inspirations were the video games Bloodborne and Castlevania. And it definitely does have kind of that darker, kind of gritty, urban, almost gothic fantasy type of feel to it. I think that's pretty interesting. That's not always my cup of tea, but I think it gives the game its own identity, and that's cool. And of course, with the different districts, each having their own personality, you can kind of lean into that more or less with different districts. So you can kind of break that up if you don't want that kind of darker gothic feel all the time, but you do want to have some of that in there, right? You can break that up with different districts having a little bit different flavor. Speaking of flavor, I do actually really like the theming in the writing of this game. I love reading through those descriptions of the world and the different districts that he gives examples of in there. And even just the little bits of description for each of the monsters in the Beastie Area, like all of that it's a very fun read. It's very creative writing, and it really sparks the imagination for the GM who's going to put all this into scenarios for the actual campaign. So I like that. I like the overall structure too. I like the premise that the heroes are basically professional monster hunters, so they have a reason built in for them to be there, to be investigating and hunting down these monsters. And I like how the game kind of lends itself to not just straight up go find the monster and fight it, but there's an investigative part of it too, right? It sort of lends itself to that investigative angle where there's a problem in this district, you show up to deal with the problem. Maybe they know what the monster is, or maybe they just have an idea what the monster is, and you have to, at the very least, figure out where the monster is lairing, maybe what its weakness is, but you may even have to go farther than that and really discover what you are going up against to begin with. So I like that kind of angle on things. That's pretty interesting. Now, as far as the rules go, I do like how the rules are very streamlined. I like that rule of 4 as a base principle that everything else is built on. Doesn't matter if you're using a skill, if you're making an attack, whatever you're doing, you are rolling a die and you are trying to get a 4 or better on that one die. That's a really nice principle to build a rule system on, and I think it works really well here. I think overall the fact that the game is fairly rules light is one of its big selling points for me. I've played really complicated systems like Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition, a couple of Star Wars RPGs which have more robust rule systems, and I find that myself, especially as a GM, I lean more towards a rules light type of gameplay, and so this plays into that really well. It suits that very nicely. I'll talk a little bit more about how that can be a drawback to this game in certain situations. But before I do that, let me talk about what was really kind of the highlight, or at least billed as one of the highlights of the game, which is the different classes. There are those 4 different classes, and they're all very different, okay? I think as someone who has only played this as a GM, I can't really speak to that personally, how different these classes feel in play, because I haven't played any of them. But I will say that there are obviously observable mechanical differences between them, right? You have the blade who gets those kind of exploding dice, as the expression goes. If you roll a hit, you get to roll again. You get to keep rolling until you miss. That's really different from what anyone else does. The Gunslinger has those bullets that they load up, and then they can shoot as many as they want in a turn, so they can let out a bunch of shots, possibly get a bunch of hits in a single turn, but then they're going to be taking a little while to load their gun and build back up to that again. And then the Arcanus with his different special effects that he can put on people to like slow them down or do damage over time, things like that. And then the Tactician, who can really manipulate the flow of the battle so that it favors his allies instead of his opponents, right? All of that's clearly different. And it's very interesting, and it does give each person like kind of their own feel. Does it ultimately feel more asymmetrical than, for example, Dungeons and Dragons, where you have different classes with their different abilities? I don't know. I don't know that as the GM observing, that it strikes me as incredibly different from what other games have offered. But the experience might be different from the player's side. So I'll just leave it at that. I think it's fine. I don't see any problems with it. I think it's interesting. Is it really that different? I don't know. Maybe it is from a player's perspective. Going back to the rules light nature of the game, I do want to say, again, I like that. It fits my style of GMing, and I like how this game really requires very little prep if you're an experienced GM, because you have 30 different monsters you can pull from, and it's very easy to reskin those monsters or just swap out a few abilities on a monster to make it what you need it to be. So you don't really have to do a lot of like technical preparation for the game. Most of the prep that I did for the campaign that I ran was just thinking about the scenario, coming up with a scenario, NPCs, thinking about what the players did last time, how they interact with different NPCs, and kind of imagining how the situation will develop from that. That was the majority of my prep, which is, I love that, because I can think about that, throughout the week when I'm doing whatever, I'm at work, etc. And there's not a whole lot of actual sit down and Yes, you can sit down and build custom monsters and things like that, but you don't really need to spend a lot of time on that. So I like that a lot. I will say that games like this do fall into kind of a weird space when it comes to whether or not they're approachable for new people. It's rules light, but I'd say it's kind of on the lower end of rules medium, really. It's not so rules light that I would just hand it to anyone and expect them to be able to GM it, okay? To give an example of a game that I feel is super rules light and approachable for anyone is another indie game called Never Tell Me the Odds. Super rules light. I think anyone who understands basic storytelling principles could pick that up and GM it and have no problem. This, I think it's a little more advanced than that. It's also not as robust as something like Dungeons and Dragons, which is very robust. But I feel like at the same time, because something like Dungeons and Dragons has so many rules, the rules are very robust with, you know, contingencies to cover just about any situation. I think in a sense that type of game is actually more approachable for some players who are just coming into role-playing games, especially if they're coming into tabletop role-playing games from maybe being familiar with like PC or console RPGs, right? Because they're going to come into a situation where there's a lot of rules, but there's also not a lot of questions because the rules cover just about everything. This kind of falls into a weird middle ground where the rules are not so simple that it's almost just a binary pass-fail regardless of the situation, you know, and all you have to do is focus on the narrative. There's a little more to it than that. But at the same time, there's a lot of points that the rules don't cover specifically, so it doesn't have that robustness to it where there's, you know, no questions because everything has a rule for it. So for that reason, I feel like it's kind of this weird middle ground. It's almost in like limbo where it's not going to be the most approachable game for new GMs. That being said, if you have a little bit of experience under your belt, I think you'll do fine with it. And I think it's really nice if you're the type of GM who doesn't want to get bogged down in a lot of rules, but you want enough rules to create a nice framework. So it is excellent in that regard. Just a couple of things about the rules. As you're reading through it, you're going to want to pay attention to what you're reading, and you're going to want to check everywhere. Because there were a few times when I was first reading through the rules where I felt like things were missing from the rules, but you look a little bit farther and you can find it, right? So just as an example, there was somewhere when you're reading about the Arcanus character, there's somewhere where it talks about rolling on the Bane table, and I was looking all through the book and I couldn't find a table labeled Banes, and then it's on the character sheet for the Arcanist. That's the only place that table exists. So there's a few little things like that where I feel like there could be some more clarity in the rulebook, right? That table could have been copied in the rulebook where it was referenced in the rulebook, or there could have at least been a note that said this table was on the character sheet for the Arcanist. But, you know, it's just little things like that, right? So everything that you need to play the game is there. You just might have to look for it a little bit on your first time through. I do understand that this is the first version of the game, and there is a version 1.5 that's going to be available soon. I haven't seen that myself, but I have seen kind of a rundown of some of the changes. They all look like positive changes to me, so I'm pretty excited about that. If you buy the PDF of Slayers, the first edition, then when version 1.5 comes out, you're supposed to be able to get that free. So if this interests you at all, don't hold off waiting for version 1.5. Go ahead and get it now, and you'll get that update automatically when it's available. So in any case, I definitely recommend Slayers if anything that I have mentioned sounds appealing to you, whether it's the kind of dark gothic fantasy setting, this big sprawling city, the heroes as professional monster hunters, or if it's the kind of rules like light to medium approach with the asymmetrical player characters. If any of that sounds interesting to you, definitely check out Slayers. Again, my name is Nathan. You're watching Nice at Dice. Thank you so much for watching, and you enjoy the rest of your day.